Want to welcome everybody to today's spring meeting for the Wires Group. Happy to have everybody here. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers, and we want to get started and jump right into it. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Jody Moskowitz, who's this year's president for Wires. And Jody is going to go ahead and introduce our special keynote speaker for today's session. So Jody.
Thank you, Larry. Good morning. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Wire Spring 2024 members meeting. So great to see so many of you in person this morning. With Congressman Caston addressing our gathering last evening and FERC Commissioner Mark Christie here joining us this morning, in my mind, it really speaks to the strength of the voice of Wires and the influence that Wires has on issues affecting the transmission grid. It also reflects the work done by Larry and his team and our board building our influence over the years. This really is a time of unique challenges and opportunities for our Wires community. Front and center is the accelerating energy transition with a changing generation supply mix. We're also facing an aging grid, with the DOE reporting that 70% of transmission lines are over 25 years old and approaching the end of their life cycle. This could have major consequences, including power outages and susceptibility to cyber and physical security attacks. Then we have, and as we talked about this last night a little bit with Congressman Caston, ever expanding demand for electricity, driven by the move to electrification, an explosion of artificial intelligence technology, and accompanying data centers. The 9-year projected growth forecast for North America has essentially doubled from where it stood last year, as companies begin construction on AI hosting facilities that make the demands of traditional data centers look small. Last year, a 5-year forecast from Grid Strategies projected growth of 2.6%. That number has since nearly doubled to 4.7%, and planners expect peak demand across the United States to grow by 38 gigawatts. That's equivalent to the amount needed to power 12.7 million homes, a bit more than the total number of housing units in Texas. It's kind of sobering. The need for a forward-looking and clear-eyed vision is reflected in our two panels today, which are focused on the reintegration of planning and the importance of collaboration in transmission planning. From the FERC lens, Commissioner Christie may soon be joined by 3 new commissioners, which are currently pending confirmation at the Senate. We're also all currently anxiously awaiting FERC's issuance of a final rule on transmission planning and cost allocation. With that, let me introduce our keynote speaker this morning. Commissioner Mark Christie joined FERC in January 2021 after serving nearly 17 years on the Virginia State Corporation Commission, and including as chair of that commission. He's been president of both OPSI and MACRUC, which is NARUC's regional Mid-Atlantic arm. He's an attorney by training, has taught law at the University of Virginia Law School, also served as an officer in the U.S. Marine Corps. He has been a very strong advocate for ensuring grid reliability, frequently discusses resource adequacy, two very important topics to the industry. And I will just add that I have always found that Commissioner Christie's door is always open to Wires and to its members, which we greatly appreciate. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Commissioner Christie. Thank you.
I'm going to sit here in the middle so you all can see me from this side. Appreciate the invitation to come and speak with you, and we'll do a little Q&A at the end, and hopefully there's time. I'm not going to speak that long, but I want to talk to you today. Your business is obviously transmission, so let's talk about how transmission gets built, not just from a legal standpoint, but from the real world of how transmission gets built. And I speak as someone who spent 17 years as a state regulator and sat on over 100 certificate of public need proceedings. We have representatives here from Dominion and AEP, which owns Appalachian. Those are our two biggest utilities. So most of those were Dominion or AEP projects. And of those over 100 CPCNs that I sat on, I voted for every single one. And it wasn't because I was a rubber stamp or my commission was a rubber stamp. It was because in every one of those CPCN proceedings, the transmission developer, which was the utility in almost every case, came in and proved that the project was A, needed, and B, could be done at a prudent cost to consumers. So when I voted for over 100 projects to issue over 100 CPCNs, again, it wasn't because me or my commission was a rubber stamp. It was because the case was made as to need and prudence of cost. And I think there's a lesson in that in terms of where we're going, and particularly in reference to this transmission planning rule. So some of those projects were extraordinarily controversial. The longest regional line in PJM to this day is a line called the Trail Line. Runs from Pennsylvania down to Virginia. It was incredibly controversial. It was about 170 miles. To this day, it's the longest regional line that was ever actually built in PJM. Actually built as opposed to put in the RTEP and didn't get built, like PATH. So Trail got built. It didn't get built because Congress gave FERC backstop siting authority. It got built because 3 states held credible CPCN proceedings. CPCN proceedings that, by the way, I can tell you in Virginia, I went personally to numerous field hearings because we gave people a chance to come out and express their views, and hundreds came out to high school gyms. We held hearings in high school gyms in the area where Trail was going to run. And Trail in Virginia came through some of the most beautiful part of what Virginia calls the horse country. These were people who did not lack resources to oppose what they didn't want to see. It went through, I used to say, it didn't go through people's backyards. It went through their back 10,000 acres. And they opposed it vociferously. And they filled up the courtroom when we finally got to the hearing. They filled it up with about 25 lawyers. So this was vociferously opposed. It was opposed by the public. It was well-funded opposition. I voted for it. My commission voted for it. It was then litigated in both state and federal courts. Our Virginia Supreme Court upheld us. Federal courts upheld us. Ultimately, it got built. Another project, which I know the gentleman from Dominion remembers, is a project we called the Skiffs Creek Project, which was a power line that ran across the James River at Williamsburg. Colonial Williamsburg was not happy. The National Trust for Historic Preservation was one of the interveners. They fought it all the way. Not only fought it at our proceeding, fought it at federal court. It was, once again, we went down and had field hearings in Williamsburg at a high school down there. 300 people came out to a high school gym. Not one of them was in favor of it. But we approved it ultimately after building a record that showed it was needed for reliability. Trail was needed for reliability. And because of the process that we followed and the giving the public the opportunity to come in front of their own state body, I think that played a big part in why Virginia politicians didn't come out in opposition to it. We had a couple letters from congressmen, but none of our state legislators came out in opposition. They let us do it. And we approved it. And we fought all the litigation in state and federal courts trying to overturn our decision. We won all the way through every litigated appeal because we were doing the litigating. We were defending our own decision in both state and federal court. And those lines got built. And thank goodness they did. They were both reliability projects. And that's important, as we'll get to in a second. The purpose of those lines, as controversial as they were reliability projects. And as a commission, we said, this is needed to keep your lights on, people of Virginia. You don't like it, you don't want to look at us, 500 kV. You don't want to look at a 765 kV, but we need it to keep lights on. And that was a compelling argument. And that's the basis upon which we approved it. Now, I said I approved over 100 CPCNs. Most of them are local. Most of them were not terribly controversial. Wreck and rebuilds don't tend to be controversial. You know, a 5-mile wreck and rebuild, right in the same site is not going to be terribly controversial. So obviously, in terms of controversy, there's a big difference in a 500 kV greenfield project running across 170 miles versus, say, a 7-mile wreck and rebuild. But the wreck and rebuilds can be just as much important to reliability as a 170-mile regional project. There's another lesson in that, because there's a lot of people who think that local projects are all, by definition, wasteful, and they all should be done regionally, not locally. But I know that a lot of local projects make a lot of sense. They all come with their own set of facts, another important lesson. And the facts have to be put in front of, you will not be surprised to hear me say this, a state regulator. That's the way you actually get lines built, is it goes in front of a state regulator, or it should go in front of a state regulator, because look at Trail. You know, Congress can pass backstop siting authority. They did, fine, we're going to implement it. Backstop siting authority, you know, originally passed in 2005. It was never actually used. One time it was used, it got overturned at the 4th Circuit, which meant, you know, so Congress goes back and they change it, and that's fine, we'll implement it. I'll predict to you today that backstop siting authority will last until the point when FERC actually imposes a backstop siting authority on a state that just had a proceeding and found that it was not needed. That's as long as it's going to last, because the political blowback is going to be off the charts. You take the Trail line. If there had been backstop siting authority, let's say our commission said no to Trail, and FERC said, yes, you're going to build it anyway, because we have backstop siting authority. Both of Virginia's senators, Virginia's governor, every member of the Virginia House would have been on the warpath, I can promise you. They weren't on the warpath against the state commission because they trusted us to do what was right for Virginia. So that's a little aside. I think backstop siting authority lasts until the first time it's used. You cannot get stuff built without state buy-in. That's the lesson I take from 17 years as a state regulator who sat on over 100 CPCNs. That's the lesson I take from that. So what is a state regulator? Because the states are going to decide where it goes. If it's in their territory, they're going to decide where it goes. That's siting authority. They're going to decide, is it needed? And they're going to decide the cost. And you have to get the states bought into that if you really want to get stuff built. Now, if you just want to get something put in a regional plan, and that's the end of the game, fine. Like PATH, which didn't get built. But that doesn't, but you know, again, I hope the purpose here, and in your industry, is you actually want to see needed transmission built. I want to see needed transmission built. You know, the American electric grid is one of the greatest engineering achievements of the 20th century. I think there's a National Science Foundation made a list of the top 25 engineering achievements of the 20th century, and the American electric grid was the #1 achievement. It is an amazing engineering achievement. Think about bringing electrical power to people throughout the United States, urban, rural, suburban, and keeping it on remarkable degree of performance. And for a lot of reasons, because of a lot of policies, we're actually putting that whole achievement in danger. That whole massive engineering achievement is being put in danger. But that's not the topic of my speech today. The topic of my speech today is focusing on that one part that you all care about, which is transmission. Well, transmission is, you know, one of the 3 elements of that wonderful engineering achievement, along with generation, transmission, distribution. You got to have generation, obviously, to get power supply. You got to have distribution to bring it down the neighborhood and to the city block, and then ultimately the service drop to the house. But your business, which is transmission, is critically essential to get it from the generation to the distribution grid. Without transmission, we don't get the product to the consumer. The product is electricity. So we have to build it. I'm absolutely an advocate of building it. Again, I didn't vote for over 100 CPCNs if I wasn't in favor of transmission. But You cannot cut the states out of that process. You're not going to get it built if you do. And yet, you know, in this transmission planning rule, there's a lot of people running around Congress, ghostwriting letters for congressmen to send to us, saying, well, don't let the states stand in the way. You know, don't let the states be an obstacle. FERC should just do it. FERC should just impose the cost allocation. So let's get back and look at the different purposes of projects and understand that they are different. The goal of the utility system, the goal of our power system, this great engineering achievement, is reliable power at the least cost under law. That, to me, is the entire principle in the American utility system, this world achievement of engineering. Reliable power at the least cost under law. If the law says, you know, the commission, the regulators have to do certain things, we have to do it, of course. And the least cost doesn't mean that the transmission owner doesn't get a just return, a just ROE, of course. Has to meet the Bluefield Waterworks standard, has to meet Hope Natural Gas. Now I'm getting legalistic now. But under law means simply you have to meet the legal standards. It's not the cheapest, it's the cheapest under law. And just as a little aside, those of you who are lawyers or who know utility law, you know, Bluefield Waterworks is the landmark case on what constitutes a legally acceptable rate of return. And I was born in Bluefield, so I think I was meant to be a utility regulator, because I was literally born in the city of Bluefield, West Virginia, which is where the landmark Bluefield Waterworks case came out of. So I guess that was destiny. So least cost, reliable power at least cost. We can't get there without transmission. We can't get there without transmission. But when you look at the purposes of a transmission line, if I'm back doing CPCN proceedings, I'm looking at the purpose of the project that you, the transmission developer, is coming to me and saying, please approve this project and approve the cost. And one of the first questions I'm going to ask is, what's the purpose of this? If it's a project that's necessary for reliability, to me, that's the most important purpose. If it's a reliability project. The trail line that I mentioned to you, as extraordinarily controversial as that was a reliability project. The project across the James River at Williamsburg, which was going to bring power from Dominion's Surrey nuclear plant to a very heavily populated part of Virginia, what we call the peninsula. Part of Hampton Roads, it's the peninsula side. Reliability project. Those are the most important projects. And in PJM, where I spent 17 years as a state regulator, reliability projects are their bread and butter. That's why we joined PJM as Virginia. The first case I sat on as a Virginia regulator, the first important case I sat on, was Dominion's application to join PJM. And like 2 weeks after that, we did AEP's application to join PJM, for their Appalachian unit. And we approved them. We approved them because we thought regional planning could give us, occasionally, a regional reliability project that would be more efficient than a local project if the facts were there. And we were willing to let PJM plan those regional projects, but they're reliability projects. So if you're looking at a project and you say, what's the purpose? Oh, it's a reliability project. Okay, great. We need that. We start with the presumption it's a reliability project. Well, PJM also plans, and by the way, I'm going to give kudos to PJM. PJM does a great job of planning regional reliability projects. I have always had tremendous respect for the transmission planners in PJM. And the reason I have tremendous respect for them is because they came down into our CPCN proceedings, especially the controversial ones like Trail, like Skiff's Creek. The regional projects that PJM planned and put into the RTEP, the Regional Transmission Plan, they would come and testify. People like, you guys remember some of them, people like Mike Kormos, Steve Hurley, Ken Seiler. And they had their act together. I would sit on those panels and I would listen to them get on the stand under oath and be subject to cross-examination. And they made the case that their planning was accurate and that their rationale for Trail, controversial as it was. In other words, they came in and proved to us they had done their homework. They had done the planning right. Those lines needed to be built, and we found them credible, and so we issued those CPCNs. And we defended them on appeal, and we won, and we got it built. PJM also does another bucket of projects. It's called economic projects. You know what those are. An economic project, again, it's not a reliability project. It's supposed to be justified with a fairly simple metric. The cost of the line should be less than the congestion savings that you're going to get. So it's really still a numbers game. It's an objective numbers game. If the cost of the line is going to be substantially lower, there's some ratio we want to look at, then the congestion costs, then if the congestion costs are going to exceed the cost of the line by a certain ratio, ought to be built. Once again, I saw some of those. PJM could prove it. Important point, they could prove it. Now, of course, there's a big push, and this was at the heart of Order 1000. Now there's a big push. Well, let's have the RTOs and the non-RTO planners do public policy projects. Okay? That's fine up to a point. But let's remember this. A reliability project is planned by engineers. An economic project is planned by economics. A public policy project is planned by politicians. Fundamentally different. Now, in a single state RTO, that's not a problem. In New York ISO, California ISO, ERCOT, which is not even regulated by FERC, and they're on their own. They're single state ISOs. Single state ISOs, I think, should absolutely plan transmission that incorporates their state public policy. New York ISO does it with New York clean energy law. California does it with their policies. I'm fine with that, as long as those costs are kept to those states. They want to pay for it? Fine. The problem arises when you go to the multi-state RTOs. That's where the problem arises. When we went into PJM, we in Virginia, when we approved Dominion and AEP going into PJM, we didn't go in there to have our consumers pay for, no disrespect, New Jersey's offshore wind. We went in there to get regionally planned reliability projects. Reliability projects that if they come in front of us for a CPCN, like they did on Trail, they could show us the facts, and the facts would show we're getting reliability benefits. We're all in on that. And we'll pay our fair share. We will pay our fair share. And in fact, the PJM cost allocation formula, the regional cost allocation formula, and I wouldn't begin to describe it to you. It's like the school funding formula in Virginia. Nobody can explain it, but everybody lives with it. Okay? It's the same thing with regional cost allocation. No one can explain it, but everybody lives with it. Because we're getting regional reliability projects. And economic, people, there's a different argument on economic, but if you can show me the numbers, if you can show me the congestion savings, okay. But public policy projects are projects driven by politicians. And so if politicians in one state want 100% green energy, that's fine. They want to pay for it. They're willing to accept the reliability consequences. That's fine. But don't make consumers in another state pay for it unless they agree. So this gets back to the purpose of transmission lines. You cannot just say, throw it all in a bucket and regionally cost allocate everything. Because, hey, it's all sort of the same, right? No, it's not all sort of the same. Not at all. You cannot just lump them in and say they're all the same. Even a policy project has reliability benefits. Well, tangentially, it may. You can build a line almost anywhere and get some congestion relief. That doesn't mean it's the optimal solution. So, getting back to my point here, how do we get transmission actually built? How do we actually get steel in the ground? The way you actually get steel in the ground and get lines like Trail, which is, again, incredibly controversial, how do you get people to accept that? You cannot hide a 765 kV, believe me. You can hide a 5-mile wreck and rebuild. You can't hide a 765 kV greenfield project. And most regional lines are going to be long, and they're going to be 500 kV or above, maybe 365, but they're going to be lines that you can't hide. So if you want to get those regional lines built, you have got to have state buy-in. The idea that you're going to ram it down their throats and you're going to go to FERC and say, well, FERC, you have to impose cost allocation if the states don't agree to it. I think that's a pipe dream. I think that's just totally unrealistic the way things work in America. Now, I know there's people that like a Stalinist central planning system and the states are get out of the way. Well, you know, that decision was made in 1776, that states are going to be part of this system, whether you like it or not. And you best work with them, incorporate state regulators into the process, particularly on who pays. Because if you tell states, you're going to pay whether you like it or not, and that's what a lot of lobbyists are pushing us to do, and you know it. That is exactly what they're pushing. Make them pay whether they want to or not. It ain't going to work. I promise you. It might be in a final rule, and it's going to be litigated 18 ways from Sunday for years to come. And meanwhile, steel is not going in the ground. So if you want steel in the ground, and I do, I got a track record. Over 100 CPCNs, I voted for every one of them. If you want steel in the ground, if you want the projects built that we need to get built, you're not going to ram it down the state's throats. You're not going to do it. It's just unrealistic. Even if you get away with it on a project, because DOE calls it a NITSE, I guarantee you it's the last time it's going to happen. And we need a lot more than that. We need the regional lines that the RTOs are really good at planning. MISO's good at planning regional lines. PJM is really good at it. But they're all going to be controversial. You can't hide a 765. They're all going to be controversial. Every one of them. They're all going to face hundreds of people coming out to high school gyms yelling, don't do it. And without the state regulators being willing to take the heat the way we took the heat in Trail, believe me, we took a lot of heat. Unless you have the state regulators willing to take the heat and say, we know the public is opposed to this. We know there are hundreds of people that think this is coming through their backyard or their back 10,000-acre estate. But we're here to tell you, people of Virginia, we need it. We need it to keep your lights on. We know you don't want it to come across the James River next to one of our most exclusive housing developments south of Williamsburg. Won't name it, but very influential people live there, and they would have to look at it. Across the James River. They didn't want to look at it. But we said, it's needed. And we'll take the heat. Unless you have state regulators making those decisions, willing to take the heat and go to their publics and their legislators, their state legislators, and say, look, I know you're getting a lot of calls on this. I know you got a lot of constituents upset about this. But we did our due diligence, and we think it's absolutely needed. Unless you have that, these lines are not going to get built. Much less get paid for. Much less get paid for. So if this planning rule comes out and it tries to force the state's cost allocation against state consent for these policy projects, these political-driven projects, get ready for many years of litigation. And steel's not going in the ground. So, any questions? Yes, ma'am. The lady from AEP, Stacy.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Christie, for sharing that perspective. You touched on reliability projects, and I agree. I think that equation is simpler. But I wanted to ask you about market efficiency projects. So there you have instances where states might be on opposite sides of the equation. You're going to have winners and losers. So what role does FERC have in that type of situation? And do you see a future for those types of market efficiency projects going forward?
Well, you're obviously asking about the case in front of the Pennsylvania PUC that said no, and then you took it to federal court. Here's my view. I'm not going to speak to that case because every case comes with its own set of facts. A market efficiency project, which is an economic project, is, if I'm looking at it from a state regulatory standpoint, I want to see the numbers and I want to see, are we saving more money than we're paying? Okay? And I'm not going to prejudge a case I'm not even sitting on, but I mean, that's the kind of thing that I'm going to ask as a state regulator. Are my constituents, my consumers, are they getting as many or more benefits than they're paying? And so it's a purely factual. Here's the thing about transmission lines. I've learned from all these many scores of sitting on them. They all come with their own unique set of facts. And as a regulator doing a CPCN proceeding, you've got to judge those facts and see basically how does it fit for us. Now, if a state commission says it doesn't work for us, then do I think that FERC ought to ram it down their throats? As a principle, no. But I want to see if you're going to invoke backstop siting authority, then that's a different issue. But again, I think backstop siting authority lasts until the first time it's used. So I would put it that way. I'll say this from a legal standpoint. I don't think that just because an RTO puts a project into the RTEP that preempts state authority. That is a novel, very novel theory.
I'm going to go ahead and ask my question first, and then I'll pass it on to Stu. But thank you for your remarks, Commissioner. You focused on a lot of the issues surrounding planning, cost allocation, things of that matter. There are a host of issues dealing with transmission. One of them I wanted to ask you about is competitive transmission. We're 10 years into it now. To put it politely, the track record's mixed at best as to whether it's really producing any kind of cost savings. Whether it's resulting in delays in getting projects built. The Commission touched on this topic in the proposed rule. Is it time for the Commission to re-examine the issues around Order 1000 and competitive transmission? Is it working or not? What are the next steps with respect to competitive transmission?
Yeah, I knew there'd be a ROFR question before the day was over, and I'm sure that's one of those things that's going to see the inside of a courtroom, I'm sure, no matter what FERC does. I'll just tell you from my perspective as a state regulator, as someone who sat on, scores and scores of CPCN proceedings. Probably 80, in PJM, the figure is about 80% of the transmission spend is local. Local meaning that the costs are allocated to the zone, okay, Dominion zone, AEP zone. And so most of the projects we looked at were fairly non-controversial. Again, wreck and rebuilds are not controversial by and large. Sometimes you get into controversy over what color paint to put on it, but other than that, that's about it. I didn't see in those local cases, speaking generally, and again, as I said to Stacy, every case comes with its own set of facts. And that's really important. Every case comes with its own set of facts. I didn't see where if Dominion if somebody had told Dominion, because, Dominion and AEP both had a practice, when they came to us on let's say, a local project, they competed the construction. They did an RFP, and we always ask about, did you do a serious RFP? Did you seriously try to get, a construction contract that was the most efficient you could get? So we would ask questions like that, which is the importance of having a CPCN proceeding. So they competed the construction, but the commodity price of steel is a commodity price of steel. If it's a wreck and rebuild, you're not buying right away. So that wasn't even an issue. I don't, now on a regional line like Trail, I don't see where, competing it would do anything. The only thing I see in competition is that, a competitive developer might say, well, I won't take QUIP, or I won't take abandoned plant. They can sort of give away the incentives as part of their bid. But you take some cases. There was a case from California, and I wish I remembered it, but Neil, remember that case? It was, Neil Yalabandi works for transmission for me and MISA. What was the name of that case? It was a December case. Yeah. There was a project out of CAISO, and I did a concurrence on it. Go back, and I think it was in December. No, actually, I think it's last September. And I did a concurrence on it. And it was a competitively bid project in CAISO. It was competitively bid by CAISO, and a competitive provider won it, promised a cost cap. Okay, by the time the one we had to approve last September, the ultimate price, the ultimate cost was like 5x the bid price. It blew past the original competitive price. It blew past the cost cap by like 5x. And I put in my concurrence, you know, what happened to competition? It wasn't a silver bullet here. Because once you start building something, the costs are the cost. And of course, you get to come to FERC on formula rates and, you know, and go all the way back to basic standards of utility regulation. Costs that are prudently incurred have to be recovered. That's a constitutional standard. That's a Fifth Amendment constitutional standard. So, you know, this is a regulated industry, as we know. And many Supreme Court cases going back to Bluefield say you have to give cost recovery for prudently incurred costs, and you have to give a return that meets constitutional standards. So you know, I didn't in the many local projects that Dominion and AEP came in on. I don't remember ever thinking we could save a lot of money if PJM had bid this out, because first of all, if it's in Dominion right away, is the competitive developer going to buy the right of way from them? Well, there's a cost. And is Dominion going to stand aside and watch them wreck down their, you know, tear down their project? I don't know. There's a reason the utility industry for 125 years has been a regulated monopoly. There's a reason. It's because it's a natural monopoly. There's a reason it's been a regulated monopoly, because it is a natural monopoly. You know, now we had a big debate in the 90s, starting in the 90s, that, oh, well, you know, you can compete generation. And I think, you know, and an argument can be made that it certainly was made starting in the 90s with so-called deregulation, which was never deregulation, but more of a restructuring. Okay, generation can be competed, but how do you do that? What we did in Virginia, we pushed Dominion, mostly unsuccessfully, to start bidding out energy purchases. In other words, don't build, especially when you build in renewables, you know, don't build the solar farm, put out an RFP and just buy it. But that's the way you compete generation. You still tell your regulated utility, your monopoly, don't own it and put it in rate base, you know, put out an RFP and try to buy it. But that only goes so far, because, you know, this mixes into the reliability thing. You've got to have units like nuclear, which Dominion has, combined cycle gas, and they've got to be rate-based. Because if they're not rate-based, they're going to shut down. We see that all over the country. That's another big issue we've got in America, is we have, and I've spoken out on this many times, we are closing dispatchable generating resources at an unsustainable pace, because the markets are not working to keep these units open. So PJM, MISO, ISO New England, they're all writing RMR checks, right? Well, RMR is an acronym that stands for market has failed. That's another speech in itself.
Commissioner, thank you for the comments. Maybe this will build a little bit, and also on this thought, but also go back to the reliability comments that you had earlier. So it stems on, what is the definition of a reliability project? And typically it's been, you know, somewhat narrow, right? A reliability violation, NERC-based rules. But as we look at an evolving system and we see resiliency in more extreme weather, and we've lived through, you know, issues in Texas, for example, and we look at the changing generation mix with more variable supplies, and transmission might be a key to being more reliable and helping customers be in service. Is there an opportunity, do you think, in terms of what do we define in that reliability bucket, that we might be able to get states to buy in and to move transmission forward?
I think PJM can define a reliability project for you quite adequately. They're driven by NERC violations, anticipated NERC violations, threatened system overloads, thermal violations. I mean, it's an engineering question. And so, to me, a reliability project is one that the engineers have said this is needed, and I trust the engineers. You know, in economics, as I was talking to Stacey, it's about the numbers. Like, show me the numbers. Show me the cost savings versus the cost of the project. In terms of congestion. When you move beyond that, and I know the big argument is, well, you shouldn't silo these projects. Throw them all into one bucket. Don't silo them. The problem is, I can accept that there are, like let's take interregional. And interregional is simply really, the real definition. And whenever I hear interregional, my first question is, how do you define it? Interregional is one LDA to another. Is one utility zone to another. Interregional is DOM zone to Maryland, to PEPCO. Or does it have to cross a state line to be interregional? Does it have to cross an RTO seam to be interregional? What is your definition of interregional? But it gets back to the purpose of what are we trying to do with this? What are we trying to do with this line? And if it is being built to serve somebody's 100% renewable mandate, then the states you're going to allocate costs to ought to have the right to say whether or not we're willing to pay for it. Whatever ancillary benefits you might impute to it, the states have to have the authority. I think if you want that state buy-in, they ought to have the authority to say, this is a policy-driven line. We don't want to pay for it. We don't see any benefit in it for us. It's not our policy. We're not the ones with 100% renewable mandate. If you're West Virginia, why should West Virginia pay for Maryland's 100% renewable mandate? The term resilience, always, ever since I started hearing this term resilience about 15 years ago, going to OPSI meetings and MAC group meetings and NARUC meetings, my first question was tell me how resilience is different from reliability. And I've had about 28 different definitions from the time I started asking that. One definition, well, it means you can recover faster. Okay. Well, if you can document it, here's the whole point. And this back to my core point. To get a project built, if you want to call it a resilience project, fine, call it a resilience project. Come into my courtroom and show me what I'm getting, what my consumers are getting. If you can show me we're getting benefits, I don't care what you call it. Call it a banana project. If you can show me benefits to our consumers in terms of reliability, reliable power at the least cost. Again, let's get back to that core principle that drove the most impressive, wonderful engineering achievement in this country in the 20th century. Reliable power at the least cost under law.
Thank you, Mr. Christie, for being here. Mike Batta with Dominion. Switching a little bit from the main topics here, I want to talk about some of your comments on the Formula Rate process. Mm-hmm. I don't recall exactly where, but I believe you said things like you could throw anything in there. 2005, Dominion joined PJM. We were on a stated rate, switched to a formula rate. That was during my time when that was in my wheelhouse. So I'm just curious, your views on formula rate as far as, I believe many transmission owners use a formula rate process.
Yeah.
What specifically is the problem there that you're looking at, and what would you, generally speaking, propose as a better way of doing it?
Well, first of all, FERC formula rates come with a presumption of prudence. A presumption of prudence. That is contrary to everything I've ever learned about utility regulation. I mean, every time Dominion comes into the State Corporation Commission, they don't come with a presumption of prudence. Whether Dominion's coming in on a rate case, whether they're coming in on a CPCN for a generating unit, whether they're coming on a CPCN for a transmission project, with rate recovery for a rate rider, Dominion comes, as any applicant comes, with the burden of proof. And FERC says, though, that in formula rates, you get a presumption, it's already prudent. That's number one problem I got with it, because I think it goes against every principle of utility law, that it comes with that presumption. Now, I'd be willing to give that presumption if that project came out of a state that had a serious, credible CPCN process, like Virginia. Because then I know state regulators have looked at it and done their due diligence. But there are states where the legislatures, I'm sure not by coincidence, have taken away the authority of their state regulator to even do that kind of proceeding. On the theory that, well, we're in MISO, and I mentioned MISO because a lot of these states are Midwestern. We're in MISO, and they do all this, so we don't need our state regulators to do it. No. MISO's process, the process of putting a project in a regional plan is not even remotely comparable to what state regulators do in a serious and a credible CPCN process. You know it because Dominion's been through them. And still got your stuff built, okay? But you had to prove it. But for FERC to just say, come on in on a formula rate and we'll give you a presumption, I mean, that's unheard of in utility regulation. I got a big problem with that. But again, I'm willing to live with it if I know it's coming from a state where there was a serious CPCN, so at least they looked at need, they looked at prudence, and so the states have at least had a chance to do their due diligence. Well, in a challenge process, there isn't any realistic challenge process. I mean, yeah, but the reality is, FERC is in Washington, D.C., okay? That'll come no surprise to people. If you're in Oklahoma, Kansas, Montana, South Carolina, and you're a co-op or a consumer advocate or a state commission, and you want to challenge the formula rate filing, and you're out in Omaha, or I guess Lincoln's the capital, Nebraska I'm talking about. You're not going to come camp out in Washington for 6 months fighting a formula rate filing. It's just not realistic. It's not realistic. Which is, again, why I think these kind of things should be back at the state level. Now, since Order 888 and the unbundling, of course, transmission rates have come to FERC. You can debate whether that was a good thing or not. But they do, and they have since Order 888. So the reality is if those rates are going to be determined up at FERC and not by state regulators, as they used to be, then it is just simply next to impossible for most people who would challenge a line item, challenge a cost item, to come to FERC and camp out for a few months in Washington and seriously fight that filing. It's just not there, particularly when you layer on top of it, the FERC has said there'll be a presumption of prudence, which is unheard of in utility regulation. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. But let's look, but I'm glad you brought up Dominion, because let's look at what happened in Virginia. So every generating unit you wanted to build, that Dominion wanted to build, and I approved 4 combined cycle generating. And we still need to build a combined cycle. A lot of groups don't want to hear that, but we have a need to build more combined cycle generating gas, that is, the dirty word gas. We need more of it, not less. The time I was on that commission, we approved 4 of your combined cycle. But we did every one of them with a serious CPCN proceeding where you came in and made the case, and we said, yeah, you're right. And there was opposition, as you know, okay? We also approved scores of your transmission projects, and you had a piece of trail. And of course, Kiss Creek was yours. And so we knew you were going to go to FERC and get formula rate recovery on Skiff's Creek, and we knew you were going to go to FERC and get formula rate recovery on Trail, as controversial as those was. But we also knew, because we had done our CPCN, our due diligence, that those lines were needed. They were reliability projects and they were needed. And so we at least had the comfort of knowing if we approve these things, we've done our due diligence. Dominion's come in, PJM has come in, they've testified, they've proved to us that these lines are needed to keep the lights on. And on that basis, we approved it. So while you then got to go to FERC for formula rate recovery, we knew that those lines were needed. And if we felt there was an item we were going to challenge, which we don't think we ever did, we knew, though, that the lines themselves were needed. In states where that's not even happening, and there are states where that's not even happening, I think that's a big missing link. Fortunately, in Virginia, it's not a missing link, because you came to us, you got CPCNs, we approved them, and formula rate recovery at least took place after we'd had the chance to do our due diligence and said, yeah, Dominion's right, we need to build them. And then we defended our decision, as you know, because it got appealed to every court in America trying to stop it.
Commissioner Christie, I have a question. I'm going to take this from a little bit of a different angle. So
Yeah.
you started talking about the that you recognize the need or the acute need for new transmission,
Yes.
new iron in the ground. We
Yes.
all agree with that to maintain reliability. We also, I think all of the WIRES members participate and are subject to state CPCN proceedings. I know in New Jersey, we have a very robust CPCN process. I've personally participated in many of those proceedings. They're very contentious. As you said, they can take a very long time. The state will certainly kick the tires on need and cost and alternatives. All of that happens. So I guess my question to you is, given that, what FERC policies now are needed to encourage new transmission, to get more transmission built? Given that we all recognize that there's a need for it and incredible demands and strains on the system, we have the state CPCN construct in place. I mean, maybe we could debate whether every state has a robust process as you would like to see, but I struggle with what more can be done and what should FERC be doing to get more transmission built?
Well, let me just say something about, you mentioned, well, state proceedings take a long time and it takes, let me tell you, I'm all in favor of time limits imposed on state proceedings, but they have to be imposed by state legislatures. Virginia imposed time limits, our legislature imposed time limits on us on CPCN proceedings as well as rate cases. And I'm fine with that. It actually helps clarify the mind. And you lay out a schedule and you do it. If you got 1 year to do CPCN, you do it. And I think that's frankly a reasonable amount of time. So number one, I think I'm all for state legislatures imposing timelines on their state commissions in terms of how quickly they have to act on a CPCN or a rate case for that matter. They shouldn't drag on for 2 or 3 years. They shouldn't. It's ridiculous. As far as what FERC should do, let's first understand one thing. So in the last decade, national transmission rate base has almost tripled. Almost tripled. So let's not pretend that nothing's getting built, okay? Let's not pretend that nothing's getting built, that the system was pre-World War II and it's falling down. Let's have some honest talk here, okay? When you triple rate base, a lot of stuff is getting built, all right? Now, some people say, well, yeah, but it's the wrong kind of stuff. The people who want to regionalize everything say, well, it's all 80% of it's local projects. I just told you a lot of local projects make all kinds of sense. The fact that it's 80% local doesn't give me any heartburn. What gives me heartburn is the idea that somebody at the state level is not getting a chance to look at those projects and determine whether they need to get built. So the same incentives are there that have been there for the last 125 years. If you're getting a constitutional rate of return, there's money, better than I do, there's a lot of money to be made in transmission. So what we need is a regulatory process that moves those projects on an expeditious basis, and I have to tell you, most of that's going to be at the state level. The states should be the ones doing the CPCN processes, and they ought to do them on a timely basis. Again, I'm all for time limits. I'm all for statutory time limits. And, I think it's Section 215, don't hold me to it, but I think it's Section 215 of the Federal Power Act that says FERC has no authority to order the construction of a generation unit or a transmission asset. Okay? So let's not look to FERC as the big, sugar daddy in Washington that's going to get all this stuff done. Ultimately, assets get built at the state level because states have the authority to order the construction of generating units, which we need a lot more of, especially combined cycle gas, and transmission assets. Again, FERC does not have the authority to order the construction of any generation or transmission asset. It doesn't.
Mr. Christie, thank you very much. Building a little bit on Larry's question, if we can't get projects done without the states, what is the value of Order 1000? What's the value of it?
If you can't get a project approved
If
at
we
the
can't
state
get a
level?
project approved without the states, why is FERC even getting involved in Order 1000? What's the value of it? Because you said it yourself, nothing's going to be built without it. And we're constantly in this fight between states' rights versus the federal system. What's the value of it?
You're presuming I'm a fan of Order 1000?
Oh, no, I'm not. I'm trying to lead the witness. Sorry. No.
That's all right. You can lead on direct. No, you cannot lead on direct, actually. You can lead on cross. So I assume that was cross of a hostile witness. I think it's a very good question. The complaint about Order 1000, it hasn't resulted in any projects getting built. Well, I think the whole premise was wrong to start with. I mean, look, again, you're not going to get projects built without state buy-in. I'll say this, the biggest single flaw of Order 1000 was the failure to bring the states in a systematic way. It was FERC acting as the federal, all-knowing, all-powerful, at least wannabe, entity that's going to force the states to do stuff that their people are not willing to do. And that's Exhibit A in my case today. It didn't work, did it? It didn't work because it didn't bring the states into the cost allocation. Who pays? And so if we make the same mistake again in this one, it's not going to work any better than Order 1000.
Well, we'll do one more question if you have time.
I got time.
All right.
Questions, you got time.
Good morning, Commissioner. Thank you for being here today. Amanda Rumsey with PPL.
Yeah.
We talked a lot about building needed transmission, but I also heard you mention the pace of generator retirements.
Right.
And understanding that transmission and generation need to work together in order to provide reliability that you've mentioned as one of the core functions of the business. What are your thoughts on how to get more generation online, or what could be done by Congress or states to kind of close a gap that I think that I've heard and read that you're concerned about?
I'm very concerned. I've said this many, many, many times, that in the United States today, we're heading for a reliability crisis. Okay? I don't use that word for melodrama, but because increasing power outages and the threat of week-long, 2-week-long power outages like we saw during Uri is a crisis. It's a catastrophe. Uri was a catastrophe for Texas. I mean, people literally died. 100 people, hundreds. So losing outages are not what Americans expect. Americans expect 24/7, 365. Now, we know that we're not going to get that, but that's got to be the goal. Okay, and you also know most of the outages are distribution line. Tree falls on a distribution line. That's where most of the outages come from. But Uri was a power supply failure. It wasn't trees falling on distribution lines. It was a power supply failure, as in lack of power supply. So what are we doing in America? We're facing a demand curve which is going up, and it's going up astronomically now with AI and crypto and data centers. And, as a state regulator from Virginia, Data Center Alley is Northern Virginia down to Richmond, as the man from Dominion knows. It is rapidly increasing our load forecast in DOM zone. And I was talking to some people from ERCOT the other day. We don't regulate them, but they wanted to come in and talk, and always willing to do so. They were telling me that the area around Midland and Odessa, Texas, has become the new crypto capital, and they're getting crypto miners going in there. And they said on the current projection, with the crypto miners going into the Midland, Odessa part of Texas, the load in Midland, Odessa is going to exceed the load in the Dallas Metroplex within 2 years. Now, if you're from Texas and you know how big Midland and Odessa are, and you know how big the Dallas Metroplex is, the idea that load would be bigger in Midland than in Dallas, but it's because of crypto. Okay, so this is what's happening with load. And what are we doing on generation resources, particularly dispatchable? And there is a difference. We're doing that because we're retiring all across this country in RTOs and non-RTOs. We are retiring the dispatchable resources that you have to keep the lights on. If you know how to run a system, you know you cannot do it on 100% wind and solar. You can't. Okay, not under current technology. Okay, not under current technology. NISO has even invented an acronym, DERF. It's like designated emission-free resource, and they're plugging it into their 10-year plan because it hasn't been invented yet. So they use an acronym. It's got to be emission-free. It's got to be dispatchable, emission-free resource. And it hasn't been invented yet, but they're plugging it in with an acronym. We cannot be shutting down these dispatchable resources at the same time we're seeing load forecasts skyrocket. And it's happening in both RTO and non-RTO for different reasons. In the non-RTOs, it's happening largely through IRP processes. Utilities are going to their state regulators and saying, we want to shut down all our coal units so we can build wind and solar. Or combined cycle. But the problem is, it is extremely, you all know in the business, it is extremely difficult to build a new combined cycle. It takes 8 years now. I haven't had anybody tell me they can build a new combined cycle in less than 8 years. With all the permitting, all the legal, all the opposition, because anything with the word gas in it is going to get opposed by Sierra Club or other environmental groups. Any gas facility, whether it's even a compressor station on a pipeline, is going to get opposed by environmentalists. Much less a 1,500, 2,000 megawatt combined cycle. So that's the only dispatchable resource that we're even building. Now, Southern just finished Vogtle, but you know what the cost was. And it was a stick build, and you know what the cost was. And I'm glad they did. But, you know, the idea we're going to go out and build a bunch of Vogtles, given the cost, that's not realistic. So we're closing down these coal units. And again, in the RTOs, the problem is they're just not getting compensated in the markets. And now they're facing the EPA power plant rule, which is designed to destroy what's left of the coal industry. Let's get real. It absolutely is. So where are we left? We're left with combined cycle natural gas. That's all we're left with, except for the places where you have some nuclear. And you can't run a system on that. You cannot run it on nothing but intermittent. Batteries give you 4 hours at most. You can't keep the lights on in Chicago at night for 4 hours if the dispatchable resources are gone. So that's the fundamental problem.
Any thoughts on congressional or state action that could do more to fix the problem?
Well, states are the ones who decide what gets built, and states are the ones who decide what gets retired. I make that point all the time. Whether you're in an RTO, whether you're not an RTO, ultimately what gets built and what gets retired is a state matter. And I would say most of you are pretty adept at going to your state legislators and your state regulators. So you need to have that conversation with them.
Well, Commissioner, your comments are a great prequel to our next panel, which is going to focus on reintegration of planning. So I want to thank you and thank Neil for coming with you and spending so much time talking to us today.
Oh.